what's happening in Quebec does not stay in Quebec.
I know how good my memory is.
Do you even remember what we talked about?
Realistic expectations.
We're talking about America.
And this is from like the people at Top Rank.
Arslanbek Mahmudov.
Like Matchroom, because they have the zone.
Satredin Akhmedov.
I don't write anything down. I don't take notes.
You've been talking to Eddie Hearn about Canada.
Memorize everything in my head.
I don't want you to give up your secrets.
They don't sell.
I'm sure you've been thinking about it.
Thousands and thousands of hours.
What will be your style?
And the ability to read a fight.
We are live. Rian Scalia. I call you Scalia, but people call you Scalia. And
yeah, that's how it is.
But what about Justice Scalia? They call him Scalia, not Scalia. What's the difference there?
Well, they're pronouncing it wrong. That's the difference.
All this time, they were pronouncing his name wrong. So it's Scalia.
Yeah.
Is it so? It kind of sounds Italian, but you're not Italian, right? You're.
Well, it is Italian.
Oh, it is Italian. Okay, so you have some Italian ancestry in you.
Yeah, some.
Cool. All right, man. So that's a little start for our podcast. You are on this podcast for the second time. So in my English-speaking podcast life, you are the first guy who actually decided to come back to the podcast. So I really appreciate that. And now we have a different format. Now we're talking in Zoom over the Zoom call and all of that. So, but you also were the first ever English-speaking guest. Well, actually, Tom Loeffler was the first ever English-speaking guest, but you were the first ever English-speaking guest who I also recorded on film. So you are still a very special guest to me. And the fact that you're returning, it's actually exciting because now we can actually do like a little deep dive in what you do and what are your thoughts on what's happening. And basically, I just want to talk about you and your processes. So how are you doing, sir?
Good, man. Yeah, this is going to be a lot better than the first one because, I'm not coming off an all-nighter, so I can actually think straight and not falling asleep. But I'm good.
Yeah. You've mentioned that several times that you were falling asleep and you were like pretty much, sleeping while we were recording that podcast. So was that really true? Like, where you really cannot handle it? Do you even remember what we talked about?
Yeah, I do, but it wasn't as good as it should have been.
All right. Well, let's set this record straight. So I actually wanted to preface that with the fact that you are very well known within the boxing community for your scouting knowledge, and also for the knowledge of the amateur boxing. People across the world, especially in the United States and the UK, use you as their consultant for the references in terms of certain prospects. Can you talk to me about how you actually? Like, how does your process of scouting works, and what are you working on right now, and how do you handle the situation usually on a day-to-day basis when you need to do your research?
Well, I guess I'll kind of bring it back to how I guess it started in that regard. Basically, running up to the 2016 Olympics. That was when I kind of got heavily into that regard because I was gambling on the fights and I did very well on that. And back then I was just thinking this is what I want to do. And I said to myself that in 2020 I'd be going to the Olympics for scouting. Obviously now it's 2021, but I still pretty confident that'll happen. But yeah, basically, you look at the amateurs, it's the same concept as, like other sports leagues like NFL, MLB, soccer, NHL, they all have scouts. Boxing doesn't really have it in that regard. I think, there's very few people that kind of specialize in that aspect, of boxing. And I kind of wanted to carve out my own niche, and that's what I'm in the process of doing, because I think you always want to, in any aspect of whatever your work is, I think you want to separate yourself from the pack and distinguish yourself and have a specific skill set that other people don't have. So over the years, that's what I've been developing. basically just accumulating knowledge. People might think sitting around and watching fights is just entertainment or something, but no,
Mm-hmm.
I do it to study. I do it to improve my own skills. I do it to improve my ability to evaluate what I'm seeing and apply that in a practical manner. So I'll go back and watch fights of current champions or older champions from the past, and I'll watch fights from when they're 14, 15, 16 years old, and it gives me context, because then I can use that and say, well, this is what a future champion looks like at 15 years old. It allows me to contextualize what I'm seeing in the present when I look at present, teenage prospects, I guess. And I always go back and evaluate what I'm seeing. That's the main thing, is evaluation, because it's one thing to know what's going on in the amateurs and the pro scene, but the ability to evaluate it is a completely different thing. And that's how you get to the next level of that stuff, because the reality is, it's few and far between fighters that actually pan out. If you look at who gets signed, who the top amateurs were, it's only a smaller percentage of them that actually pan out. So I have to be able to pinpoint who's in that smaller percentage, and identify the top talent who can make it in the pros. So basically, in 2017, I think I had people start approaching me about this kind of stuff, and then it went from there. And I was working on some big things this year in terms of joining bigger companies
Right.
or whatever. And then the coronavirus hit, kind of stalled everything. So now I'm kind of in a holding pattern. But basically, my goals are obviously that kind of scouting thing, and then my other goal is just to build boxing in Canada, because I know the potential that's here. I know the talent that's here. We just need to build that infrastructure that allows the talent to develop properly, and that's what I want to do. And I think I have the ability to do it. It's just a matter of aligning with the right people and bringing the right entities into Canada, basically. And that's what I've been in the process of doing. Obviously, we'll see how it plays out after this whole pandemic
Right.
is over.
So let's go back to the scouting thing. You've mentioned that you'd like to occupy a special niche in terms of scouting. What do you think the current scouts are not doing? Something that you actually get frustrated about, because you have other scouts that are helping out the promoters and helping out the managers. But what exactly is the main thing that distinguishes you from other scouts? Where do you see the main problem with the rest of the scouting community is?
Well, I don't think there's that many scouts in general. I mean, obviously, any manager who goes and signs a fighter from the amateurs, for a certain promoter is basically a scout. But in terms of people who actually specialize in this, I don't think it's that many. And honestly, I'm not big up in myself, but based on the probably thousands and thousands of hours that I've put into this, I think I know this field as well as anybody. And I think all the knowledge I've accumulated in this regard is second to none. And because I know how much time I've put into this, and I know how good my memory is in these types of aspects. I know that every single day I'm constantly learning, constantly sharpening
Right.
my skills. So I think in that regard, but one thing, I think people place too much emphasis on how well someone did in the amateurs. Obviously, the cream of the crop are usually top amateurs, but I think people just look at someone's amateur resume and think, oh, this guy be a good pro. but it's a lot deeper than that. You actually have to, study in depth in terms of the fights, and then you got to figure out what they're doing outside of the fights. It's not as simple as, he's a good amateur, be a good pro. It's really not that simple. And I think, time after time, you see a lot of these top amateur prospects flame out in the pros. They become busts, and they don't really pan out to what people were thinking. So I think that's part of it. I think another thing is like unrealistic expectations. It's like I said, only a small percentage actually make it. So I think a lot of people come into it expecting that, every fighter they sign is going to make it, or, sign like 10 of them and like 8 of them are going to make it. It's a lot less than that generally. And this is from like the people at top rank. If you can hit like 30%, that's in terms of, the fighters you took from the amateurs, if 30% of them can become, world champions, then that's a pretty good percentage. And in addition to that, like as a manager, you don't really make your money just becoming world champion. You make your money as far as the return on the investment that you put into the fighter. You make your money back on the defensives and then unifications and big fights, not just winning the title.
Right. So going to the top, getting to the top is one thing. Staying at the top,
Yeah.
this is where the money is.
Yeah, definitely. And like it's a business, like any other type of thing. You put a certain amount of investment in, whether that's time or money or both. And the reason people do this, I mean, I don't even do it for money. I would do it anyway, but obviously
I wouldn't say that out loud. You'll draw attention of a lot of freeloaders.
Yeah, but I mean, you have to have the passion for it, and that's,
of course, yeah,
that's the main thing. But obviously, making a living is important, so that's one thing. But I think the passion is the most important thing. And if you commit to something and you go all in on it and you work hard, then you should reap the benefits anyway, right?
Absolutely. Listen, for 2016 Olympics, a lot of people in professional boxing, in terms of like a lot of people who gamble and bet, they all praise you because apparently you've hit some incredible record in terms of like getting everything right in terms of who's going to win and all the bets. Can you talk a little bit about that? And you actually mentioned that as well, that you've been, making some money during the Olympics as well, basically on betting. Can you talk about how you were preparing, what kind of research you've done, and were you also surprised at how right you are, or you were just confident in your statistics? Like, tell me about that period of time.
Well, I was just confident. I don't really do statistics or anything. I don't write anything down. I don't take notes. I just memorize everything in my head. I don't really do notes and stuff like that. But I was just confident based on what I'd seen, over the years leading up to that. And the main thing is, like, I knew this stuff better than the odds makers. So that's why I was able to do well. And, me and Fight Ghost, that's, my
that's
main guy.
Yeah, that's who I meant. He was praising you, like a very popular personality on Twitter. It's funny. It sounds like you're some sort of a Rain Man. You have this whole thing in your head figured out. Maybe like it's like a photographic memory or something like that. What exactly are you memorizing? What kind of information do you use when you are, for example, betting on a boxer? Give us some examples. I don't want you to give up your secrets or anything like that. But just for example, what kind of main metrics or what kind of main factors are you kind of like prioritize when you think about a boxer?
Well, I don't think there are any secrets. Just memorize, the fights they've been in, the results. Try to do your due diligence on what's happening outside the ring. And again, it all comes down to, me trying to constantly improve my ability to evaluate what I'm seeing. That's what it comes down to, and the ability to read a fight. And oftentimes you run into fights where the odds makers really don't know that much about one of the fighters
Mm-hmm.
or both of the fighters, and so they'll put a bad line, and you got to capitalize on
Mm-hmm.
that.
So you've mentioned that, there is a cream of the crop, right? If you're in the amateurs, and they're usually, the ones that are being prioritized in terms of like drawing the attention from the managers and promoters. But you also mentioned it's not necessarily the way to go. There's other possibilities. You don't have to like look at you don't have to like only rely on the cream of the crops. There are other boxers that are equally as good. It kind of reminded me of this movie called Moneyball.
Yeah.
Based on the book with Brad Pitt and baseball team, and you've mentioned you don't look at stats or anything like that, but basically the whole premise is that they used not the best players in the league with like the best, the superstars, but they created a super team based on the actual, statistical advantages that they calculated. Now, I know you told me that you're not really looking at numbers or anything like that, but do you feel like some of that can apply, at least in spirit, to what you talking about in terms of like, yeah, there are champions like in the amateurs, but there are other very talented boxers.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can identify patterns. Um, that's some of what I do. I mean, you look through the years and you look at all the champions, and you try to go back into their amateur careers and into their early pro careers on the way up, and you try to identify what they did, basically. You try to go through the records,
Mm-hmm.
see who they fought, what their accomplishments were. Obviously, that's just on paper, but it gives you a decent idea of what they're capable of, and then you have to go deeper than that.
Mm-hmm.
You try to see something on paper, and then you see something on paper that looks interesting, like, oh, this guy won this, he had a bunch of stoppages, so it looks like maybe he can punch.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go check him out and see what he's about. But I think you always have to go deeper than just the statistics and
Mm-hmm.
what's on paper, because at the end of the day, it comes down to talent.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of it comes down to talent and work ethic, and you can't really determine that by looking at stats too much. You have to go witness it for yourself.
It sounds like at the beginning you look at the opposition first, which makes sense. You box reg the guy, you see who he fought, and you see who his opponent fought before to sort of like trace, like, and you just by that, and using your own experience, you can see, for example, the strengths and weaknesses of certain opponents, and you sort of can, I guess, predict or guess how the boxer that you're interested in handled those strengths and weaknesses of their opponent, and that's kind of the first thing you do. But and as you mentioned, that's not enough. And so the question to you is the footage important? Because I know that you know a lot of boxers in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, but there's not a lot of footage on them if they're fighting on the amateurs, because mainly those things are not being televised uh, in that area, and so information is not available. Is that a problem for you, and how do you handle it?
Well, there is a lot of footage. You just have to know where to look for it. I mean,
Okay.
it's gotten to the point where, like, I've seen so much stuff in Russian and looked up so much stuff in Russian that I
Hmm.
can kind of start reading the Cyrillic alphabet, and like I can start seeing certain words and
Right.
stuff like that. But because I know where to look, I know how to look for these things. I mean, like, almost every amateur tournament in Russia is broadcast
Hmm.
online,
Hmm.
and lots of tournaments in Kazakhstan also.
Hmm.
And most tournaments in Ukraine are broadcast online. So there's
Then I guess the
a
problem
lot.
is that the English speakers, for example, I guess they're not posting that on YouTube, and they don't put the English words in that in terms of the title. Here's the amateur championship, blah blah blah. You have to
Right.
sort of, that's why you have to like use a little trick to understand where to look for. Okay, I guess that makes sense. That's fair. And so then the footage is the part that you looked at it as well, right? Is the part of the whole process for yourself.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's the bread and butter.
Mm-hmm.
It's like in the pros, you can see a guy who's 20-0, but he's fought 20 stiffs.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't just look at a record and information. You have to go deeper. And I've even done like this stuff in like Chinese and few other languages. Looking up
Mm-hmm.
stuff like this.
Mm-hmm.
Worldwide, but definitely the former Soviet Union
Mm-hmm.
areas. I've
Mm-hmm.
definitely looked at that a lot, but the reality is I can't really do much with those kind of guys because I don't speak Russian,
Mm-hmm.
and the people I'm dealing with, they're more interested in like North American,
Mm-hmm.
you know, North American market kind of stuff. Because
But
the
it's funny
reality
that
is with
you're kind of famous for knowing Eastern Europeans and Central Asians so much.
uh, I don't know, but the reality is like all those fighters from that part of the world. I mean, they already have pipelines to the big show. They have like Aegis Klimas and World of Boxing with Andre Rubinski and Vadim Kornilov and that kind of route. So they already have pipelines to
Mm-hmm.
the pros,
Mm-hmm.
and some of the bigger companies, they have contacts
Mm-hmm.
that speak Russian and all that can handle these things for them. So that's kind of a different area for me that I just can't really do anything in that regard. If someone wants my advice on that area of the world, I definitely give it before. I have a few people that ask me about that stuff, few top managers and that.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as me myself, like I can't really do anything with like a Russian. I can't bring a Russian over to Canada
Mm-hmm.
or anything like that.
So that it kind of goes to the point where you don't want just to provide information, right? You also want to help out and propose more value in terms of what can you do for a boxer rather than just identify a good boxer. You want to continue working with boxer. Would that be
Well, yeah, and
correct?
yeah, I think the main aspect of that is like I said, I want to build Canadian boxing, so I want to work with
Mm-hmm.
Canadian fighters,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just a matter of producing the right scenario. I've been, like I said, I was working on that, and then coronavirus kind of hit and stalled that. But I think because we don't have the infrastructure here to really produce a lot of talent,
Mm-hmm.
outside of Quebec and Ontario to a degree, but even outside of all those fighters that are with the main promoters, there's a lot of untapped talent. There's a lot of untapped potential that
Mm-hmm.
I can see these things, and I just think if there was a better infrastructure to build these fighters,
Mm-hmm.
then I could really do something. I want to create that infrastructure, and so I think it's like kind of drawing a blank here, but
So let's talk about Canada then. Actually, because I'm in Canada as well, and I'm actually all for building a boxing here in Canada. And what would like let's think about it. Let's say like me and you got together and like, yo, like we need to make sure that Canada is really on the map. We need to make sure that there are some really great stars coming out of Canada. Um, and I would ask you like, what would you do, Ryan? So I'm sure in your minds you thought about this for a long time, and you have some thoughts about it. And what would be the kind of the first thing? Like, where do you see the kind of the pains that needs to be fixed, or something that you see and you could have done differently in terms of maybe the promotion scene, the venue scene, that maybe it's about the fighter that himself or herself, or it's about the fans, meaning like maybe like the certain towns are not getting as much exposure. What do you think about?
well, I think one of the main things is you have to bring one of the main powerhouses in boxing into the market,
Like
and
like for example, which one would you which one do you think would be a great powerhouse here?
like Matchroom because they have the zone, and
Okay.
obviously, they've been working on their international expansion with Italy and Spain, and obviously Canada
Mm-hmm.
was in the schedule. But now it's probably postponed by at least a year. The few times I've asked Eddie Hearn about Canada, he just said there's nothing concrete yet for
Mm-hmm.
Canada. So it's kind of up in the air. But I think in
So
order to go to the next level,
you've been talking to Eddie Hearn about Canada already.
yeah,
So
just a little bit. But
of
in
course.
terms of like to go to the next level, especially outside Quebec, which is really where it needs to go to the next level.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have a major platform, and that's Matchroom and DAZN that have
Mm-hmm.
the money and the ability to put on bigger shows and generate more interest. Now,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, then you have to start building the talent from there.
Right.
You know.
Is when inevitably when we speak big game in boxing, we're talking about America, and yes, we can do it
Yeah.
in Canada, and we can build shows in Canada, and we can broadcast in Canada. But when you're mentioning Quebec, and Quebec is a great province, and I've been to Montreal, and I really loved it. I was at the Bell Center for the show. It was amazing, the great experience, the best experience. There is a language, though. However, they're speaking French Canadian, and do you see that as a barrier to kind of penetrate the American market using the Canadian fighters and Canadian venues and Canadian broadcast?
I mean, it's a barrier within Canada.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the reason why boxing isn't bigger in Canada, because it's kind of like, I guess, locked away, in Quebec, so to speak. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
because the French language media doesn't reach the rest of the country, basically.
Yeah.
Obviously, like, I'm a hardcore boxing guy, so I obviously know what's going on and what's happening and all that. But even most boxing fans outside Quebec, they don't really know what's going on in Quebec, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, that's one of the reasons I started, the Great Fight North podcast, was just to kind of condense all Canadian boxing news and stuff into one thing, so people can kind of know
Mm-hmm.
what's going on. But I do think it's a barrier, and when in the past, when American TV like HBO and Showtime would go up to Montreal for fights, that's viable. It's not a problem then.
So there is a precedent.
But still, yeah, but still the thing is, like, even when HBO and Showtime went up to Montreal to do those fights, like, they would be on HBO and Showtime in the US, but in Canada, the Quebec promoter would put them on pay-per-view. So,
Mm-hmm.
and half the time, the pay-per-views, there'd be no English language feed.
Mm-hmm.
So you're basically enabling that most of the population has no idea this is even happening,
Mm-hmm.
and then you have to pay $70 for it. So it's not really a way to create new fans.
Mm-hmm. What do you think should be done then? Like because again, you've mentioned like it should be worked in Quebec. I mean, how do we make sure? How will we make sure that what's happening in Quebec does not stay in Quebec? That it goes outside of the province to the rest of Canada and to the United States in terms of information and spread of information. No, is that a media question? Is that a question of getting the exposure for the journalists that can cover those events?
Kind of, but I think it's a matter of the fighters winning the big fights. They have to produce the kind of talent that can go to the US and win,
Mm-hmm.
and then build from there. Right now, aside from Jean Pascal, who's kind of an independent fighter, obviously he fights in PBC, but as far as like promotionally, he's pretty much independent. Um, Aside from him, there's not really any fighters right now that from Quebec that are going to the US
Mm-hmm.
and winning the big fights, on the big stage. There's fighters that are being built to that,
Mm-hmm.
but as far as, world champions, not really. And I think that's the main thing. We have to create the infrastructure in order to build talent that can go to the US and win. And I think there's no problem with the talent. It's more so the system. And
Mm-hmm.
so we have to revamp the system and create the right infrastructure so that the fighters can develop properly. And that's the main thing that I think has been lacking, especially outside Quebec, and then in the West, there's not really much of a system to really develop professional talent. There's very few and far between. We
Mm-hmm.
have some decent pockets, in Atlantic Canada and then the West, but there's not really a structure, and I think it has to be built from
So
that point.
So do you mean like maybe club shows, right? So we want our prospects to fight five times a year, for example, like they do in California. There's not a lot of step up fights. Maybe there's not a lot of kind of a step by step improvement of the fighter, making sure that the fighter is ready. Is that the sort of infrastructure that you're talking about? Just that availability of the opponent and the venue, all of that come together five times a year, not on a larger scale, but more of on the scale of a club show.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, well, it all starts from the amateurs, and obviously, we just talked about that in depth on the last episode, Great Fight North, with Russ Amber and Stevie Bailey.
Hmm.
But yeah, as far as the pro scene, the thing about the pro scene is it comes down to investing money. And look, I understand people don't want to lose money. It's very expensive
Hmm.
to promote a show, and especially promote multiple shows and try to get fighters, 5, 6, 7 fights a year on the way up. And it's the problem is it's not really viable, in it for most of these promoters. So that's
Hmm.
kind of why we need someone bigger to come in, someone that's willing to invest the money, or
But
someone in general. Like I see, like Alliance Boxing Promotions in BC just started up over there. They're doing the right thing. They're trying to build the scene over there.
hmm
They're putting on consistent shows in a way
hmm
that hasn't been done over in Vancouver,
hmm
BC in years. So that's the right idea, and I think that's what needs to be done. And then if you have a local pro circuit, then it gives an outlet for a lot of these amateurs to fight. Because the reality is, a lot of these amateurs from places, even in Quebec and Ontario, like they wind up in their mid to late 20s, and it's like they have nowhere to go, and they've
hmm
been toiling around in the amateurs for years, and all of a sudden, like half their prime is gone,
hmm
and they don't really have anywhere to go, and they don't have a promoter, so they end up with like a 500 record because they have to take a bunch of fights on the B side,
hmm
and it's kind of how it works.
Батыр Джукембаев, Arslanbek Mahmudov, Sadreddin Ahmedov, to name a few who are, I would say, legionnaires, right? The guys who were brought to Quebec outside of Canada, from Russia, Kazakhstan. There are other fighters as well fighting out of Quebec, from Uzbekistan and I would say Armenia as well. What do you think about that step in terms of, it sort of sounds like cutting the corner, right, and getting the fighters that are already, you know, it's a step up from the amateurs. So they're developing those fighters here in Quebec, and they're sort of, I wouldn't say they are fighting under the Canadian flag, but they are definitely presented as the Quebecois, I would say. What do you think about that formula? And is does the Canadian um, fan from Quebec, does he or she associate themselves with fighters like that, and is this the right approach?
Well, the main problem is like they don't sell. You know, when Lucien Boutte came to Canada, he learned French, so that's one of the main reasons why he became a star and was able to fill the Bell Center, even though he was from Romania.
Hmm.
So, but Makhmudov, he's a heavyweight, so it's kind of a different conundrum there, and he
Right.
speaks English now, which you know is good enough. He's a big bad heavyweight. He knocks people out. The reality is, if Montreal all of a sudden gets a heavyweight champion, it's going to be a big deal, you know. But as far as the other guys like Sadruddin and Batir, it's tough because you're investing all this money building their careers, and they're going to end up going to fight, and you're going to end up sending them to the States, to fight the big fights probably. But at the end of the day, they don't really draw in their home base in Montreal, so it's kind of a difficult conundrum. And then, like I said before about the 30% thing, that applies to fighters from everywhere. If you can get 30% to pan out, you've done a pretty good job.
Hmm.
So some of these guys aren't going to pan out. This just the way it is. I think uh, Sadruddin and Makhmudov are the two best imports,
Hmm.
and those are the guys with the best chance. The other guys, they're solid fighters, but if if you don't draw, then it's hard to set yourself up in a favorable position to win the big fights.
Mm-hmm.
You probably are going to have to go to the US and fight as the B side, against a good champion. And then, if you lose that world title fight, then you're kind of back to square one and you still don't draw. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a difficult conundrum.
So we see, so there's a promotional company out of Montreal, right? Eye of the Tiger, and I've seen in the news that they've been partnered with Golden Boy Promotions. Can you talk about what's your opinion about that partnership, and do you know any details about that? Because honestly, maybe I just didn't read about that, but enough. But maybe there's something there. Maybe there's some sort of a light for developing some sort of an infrastructure where American and Canadian market can coexist and actually benefit each other.
Well, either Tiger and Golden Boy have a good working relationship from David Lemieux, and I think either Tiger has 5 fighters with them now, so they get along well. And the main thing is Golden Boy guarantees them at least 1 fight a year at home, which
Mm-hmm.
is obviously good for Tiger. And it just comes down to their working relationship. I
Mm-hmm.
think the main part where Golden Boy lacks is media, PR. They're really slacking in that
Mm-hmm.
department in terms of getting publicity, promotion, and attention for their fighters. So that's
Mm-hmm.
the difficult part, because when some of these guys like go fight on a Thursday night Facebook show in the
Mm-hmm.
US, like barely anyone's watching, and that's the main downside compared to like a PBC or a Top Rank that really have a lot more exposure and promotion than Golden Boy.
We speak a lot about, so right now we're speaking about Quebec and that part of town, but we never so we're not talking about the English speaking provinces here, right? So right now I'm in Toronto, I'm in Ontario. We have fighters here, we have trainers here, promotions here as well. What's next for them? What do you think the best way for them to exist in terms of the future? If let's say Matchroom or Top Rank or whoever will come to Canadian market, and as you say, let's say they will bypass English speaking provinces and they will go straight to Quebec. What about us? What about local promotions? What about local shows? Can they somehow benefit from it? What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think the major players would just bypass Toronto for Quebec. Is just a matter of some of those, especially in Toronto. One of those local promoters has to maybe secure a partnership
Mm-hmm.
with for example, a Matchroom when they come into the market, because Matchroom is going to need local fighters to put on the show, so probably have to align with a local promoter. And that's one thing I've thought about a lot. One thing that I've kind of pitched before to another company. But yeah, that's what it's going to take, really. Because especially with this pandemic now, everyone's losing money, so
Mm-hmm.
it's going to be really difficult to restart for all the local promoters, that aren't like huge businessmen, huge wealthy businessmen, with tons of money to invest. Because in terms of those kind of people that are putting money into boxing in Canada, there's very few. It's basically only Eye of the Tiger
Mm-hmm.
that can really afford to dump tons of money in
Mm-hmm.
investments into building the product.
Mm-hmm. You are slowly transitioning into a management role. That's something that you've been talking to me about in my previous podcast with you. Um, Tell me about your style. What would you suggest? What would be the priorities that you would outline for a fighter? And I just want to see you as a manager, for example, and understand. Okay, like what will be your style? Obviously, I just spoke with Jesse Caceres yesterday. He's a manager out of Los Angeles, has his management company, and he's been talking about a lot socializing and meeting people and making those partnerships. How do you see your management style in the future? I mean, we can only predict, but still, I'm sure you've been thinking about it.
Yeah, well, obviously the fighter's the most important thing. You got to do whatever it takes for the fighter. I'm I'm definitely more conservative when it comes to moving a fighter. If the fighter's not ready, he's not ready. You got to keep building. Obviously, I know the longer you build, the more money it costs. But if you believe in the fighter, then eventually you're going to see the potential fulfilled.
Hmm.
No matter how long you spend or how much money you put in, how much
Hmm.
time and money you put in. If you believe in the fighter, then it should be worth it. And I just think a lot of fighters deserve the opportunity to actually have someone looking after them, giving them the right advice, getting them the right opportunities. Because I think in Canada, there's not many people that really do that or can do that.
Hmm.
So I think that's one thing. But definitely, the bottom line is you got to look out for the fighter's best interests. And look, in terms of the other side of things, like you just mentioned, I'm no marketing specialist or anything, but I would definitely look into outside avenues like Jay Chowdhury and stuff like that to build the
Mm.
fighter's profile, as well as my own efforts to kind of do that stuff. And you know you got to get into the local community and help build their profile too as well, not just on the digital side. You got to go local and forge local relationships, local sponsorships, and
Hmm.
get in the community. So I think that's another aspect that I'm about.
I mean, that's tough, right? When you're gonna try to go local, and I mean, we're trying to sort of scrap for boxing fans, especially for a prospect, for example, right? And uh, I mean, what do you think about trying to put your word? And I like that you're sort of taking that grassroots approach, and that you're saying digital is good, but digital is not everything. You actually have to forge relationships on a personal level. Um, how challenging do you think that would that be? And do you have like a strategy in mind? Do you feel like you can sort of utilize your personal relationships with local businesses or with local boxing people? Have you had any strategies in your mind about that? And or is it something that you will think as you go, once you're gonna start managing, and you will assess then?
Well, I think you have to utilize your relationships and keep networking. And the more you network, good things are going to come about. Opportunities are going to pop up. So you have to kind of pounce on them. I think whether, maybe you go to a party and you meet some guy who has a local business and you start talking and he says, "Hey, I like boxing," and you
Hmm.
know, something like that. Who knows? Something like that can uh, can happen. But like I mentioned, Jay Chowdhury. I mean, he's very good at what he does. You
Right,
can bring
great
in
guy.
something like that. You can bring in something like that to assist you with this kind of stuff. Because at the end of the day, it's benefiting you and the fighter to make those kind of moves.
So let's put our marketing hat for a second. Since we're talking about Jay Chaudhary, we had a really great conversation about the fact that that the boxers should be providing that content, not just for their fans, but also the networks should pick up a content that the fighter would provide, such as DAZN or Fox or Showtime. What do you think in this pandemic time? There's not much content, and we're seeing all these old fights, which is great and nice. But like, if you would think about this, like, what do you think is missing right now that networks like DAZN can implement on their platforms to entertain us, to entertain the fight fans, to make sure that we don't unsubscribe from the platform? Or is it just something that needs to be written off for the time of the pandemic?
Well, I mean, the reality is people subscribe to Zone for live events, so they're in a difficult spot. I mean, they can produce content, but most of the people are subscribed for live sports, right?
Right.
So kind of difficult for them. But as far as like fighters go, like you just got to stay relevant and keep your name out there. Produce content, put yourself out there. Use this time to build your fan base, get people more familiar with you. I've seen a lot of great content from fighters. During this time.
Yeah,
I
who's your
saw one
favorite?
from
What's the best one in terms of content?
oh man, I mean, in terms of a lot of people are using TikTok. Um,
Yeah.
I think there's a female fighter from the UK with Matchroom. Shannon Courtney, and she made like a TikTok of herself side by side with. There was a clip of Tony Bell kind of telling his kids that no,
He
you
can,
can't have
I've
you
seen that
can't
one.
have tacos and chocolate. You can have toast or whatever. And she made it. You saw it, right?
I saw it. Yeah, it was funny. I loved it.
Yeah,
Tony Bellew,
yeah. I
man.
think
Like, have you seen that video of Tony Bellew? Like, where he is doing a lot of things on video, and it's so beautifully produced. I'm like, how is he doing this? But there's this cool video where he's in the car, and there's like 4 of his copies are also in the car, and they're all singing the song, something like that. Have you seen that?
yeah, Joseph Parker. Joseph Parker
Oh,
is
sorry.
another guy who did that.
Yeah, Joseph
He's
Parker
killing
did
it.
that. Yeah. Joseph Parker was that. I'm sorry. But yeah, I mean, that was beautifully done. I mean, that was funny as hell. That was also true. Like, it's crazy. But yeah, I don't know, man. How are you handling the whole thing right now? Like, what's I don't know. Do you use this time to sort of, like, for example, I'm using this time to pump as much content as possible. I'm doing all this podcasts, and it's kind of cool because a lot of people are just kind of reaching out to me and suggesting like different people, hey, like talk to this guy, talk to this, person, and all of that. So it's definitely a cool thing for me because everyone's sitting at home and they're happy to be uh, doing something. They're happy to provide some content and to provide their time to do something, right? So that's kind of cool. Like, but what about you, man? How do you utilize your time right now?
Yeah, I mean, I'm doing a lot of the same stuff I usually do, just trying to keep improving. But now, like, I even started reading books, which I wasn't doing before. Always trying to learn stuff.
Right.
Um, I should be practicing my languages. I haven't started doing it yet. I have all day, every day to do it. So
You
I
do speak
definitely,
Spanish. That one I
yeah,
remember.
and a little bit of French. I
Uh-huh.
definitely need to start getting on my French, and then, maybe if I can get better at that, I'll do Russian.
You should.
So maybe eventually I can become the Russian guy. Who knows?
Hey,
But
just download that Duolingo app. It's really
yeah,
helpful. You really should
I
try
used
it
it.
out.
I used it for French, and obviously because I, speak Spanish, the French was very easy. Within like 3 months, I was speaking, decent French. So
Hmm.
it's a very useful tool, and learning multiple languages is very useful for boxing as well.
And lastly, finally, the Great Fight North podcast is now in video format. And there was a CEO of Rival Boxing, and there was the coach, the great coach that was a guest of mine as well, Stevie Bailey, as your 2 first guests on your video podcasts. Tell me about that. And it kind of took you guys a while. I mean, I was waiting for a podcast for a long time, but like it's finally there, and it turned out really great in terms of production and everything. Tell me about that. Was that difficult to manage?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't been producing a lot of content lately just because Jason is busy with work, and
Hmm.
I'm happy that he has work because most people don't.
Of
So,
course.
so that's good. Finally got the first video out. Hopefully we can get back to a more consistent schedule,
Hmm.
in upcoming weeks. But hey, if he has work, good for him,
Yeah,
you know?
absolutely. All right, so it's just the time management thing. Cool, man. So
Yeah.
I think that was it for me. But if you want to talk about something else, don't hesitate to bring this up. But yeah, I'm just gonna you know talk. By the way, yesterday I've spoken with Serhii Bohachak, and I talked to you recently about that as well, and kind of took a little bit of your guidance to talk to the guy. And we've talked for 1 hour 30 minutes basically, and that was such a great conversation. And so what I'm thinking right now, I'm gonna break this conversation into like 3 or 4 parts, and then I need to translate it in English because I want to make sure that my English speaking audience and just in general they can sort of grasp the same exact content. So I'm going to be working on that for the rest of the weekend and maybe the next weekend. But it's definitely going to be a lot of work. But I just wanted to basically thank you for giving me some guidance and basically advising me on some of the questions. So that was pretty cool. I definitely used that information. Um, but yeah, so I'm slowly getting into the uh, I guess interviewing fighters, which I really not. I was really not really, I don't know, particularly excited about because it's a different kind of gravy, like our friend Eddie Hearn says. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, definitely. if I can just go on a tangent here,
Sure.
I'll tell everyone what I told you about Bohachuk. Is
Sure.
that cool?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Bohachuk first caught my eye in the World Series of Boxing when he fought the Cuban Olympic gold medalist Roniel Iglesias. And obviously, World Series of Boxing, 5-round fights, obviously no headgear and all that. It's kind of pro style. So basically, the Cuban was way more skilled than him, but he just dragged him into a dogfight, and he ended up winning. And so that was really eye opening. It showed me that he's really a rugged, aggressive kind of guy with a lot of heart and balls. And I kept my eye on him for the pros. And obviously, he didn't make the Olympics. Ukraine chose another guy to go to the
Hmm.
first two Olympic qualifiers, and then they sent Bohachuk to like the final qualifier. And he didn't really have a good performance. He fought an awkward guy, he lost. So
Hmm.
after that, I just saw him pop up in California, and Tom Loffer's done a really good job moving his career. He kept him really active, and this year was supposed to be a big year for him. I think Bohachuk is constantly improving, and to fight over a 12-round distance, he's going to be a tough out. I first called him the Ukrainian Margarito because
Right.
it's kind of what his style is.
And
It's going to
Steve
be
Kim and Dougie
tough.
Fisher actually mentioned that as well, that you've called him that during his first fight in Hollywood Fight Nights. I just rewatched it yesterday, and they talked about you calling that him Ukrainian Margarito.
Yeah, so he's going to be a tough out for anyone. He has a real suffocating style, and his skills have gotten better. He's adapted to the pros pretty
Mhm.
well. So I'm, looking forward to seeing him back, and looking forward to seeing your interview with him.
Yes, and I'll. It's going to be a challenge for me to make sure that everything is subtitled, and I want to dub it in English as well when I ask questions. But I'll try to handle that. Uh, I spoke with Tom Loeffler about the World Boxing Series, and he told me there was some controversy in terms of BoxRec and whether it's going to go in the record as a pro score. Do you know anything about that at all? Like, that
Yeah, I mean, it used to be like that because Fight Facts used to be the official record keeper for the Association of Boxing Commissions,
Mhm.
and basically Fight Facts considered those to be pro fights. So basically, you'd have guys turning pro, but the commission would say, "Oh, you already have these pro fights from World Series of Boxing, so your record is not 0-0. Your record is, 2 wins, 2 losses in World
Mhm.
Series of Boxing."
Mhm.
But nowadays that's gone because BoxRec is the only official record keeper of the ABC.
Right.
So that's not a problem anymore. But for a few years, it was kind of a problem. Like you used to see on certain TV broadcasts, they
Mhm.
would list the fighters' Fight Facts record. So
Right.
when Sergey Derevyanchenko fought on ESPN one time, they listed his record as like 31-1 because he had like all those WSB fights.
Right.
So yeah, but now not anymore. Now BoxRec is the only official record keeper of the ABC, so that's not a problem anymore.
So, what do you think about this? Was this justified to make it as a pro record, or is it actually the justice has been restored by basically dropping the box facts statistics?
No, I don't think it should be on the pro record because it's not fair to the fighters.
Yeah, because they didn't
You
know
know,
going into the fight. They didn't know that's going to be their pro record.
right,
First of all, so that's like
right. And the reality is like those fights were under AIBA. They were under the International Amateur Boxing
right,
Association,
right.
and they were wearing amateur gloves.
Yeah,
They were using amateur referees, amateur judges,
exactly.
amateur rules, basically.
Hmm.
So it's not fair to the fighters to list those as pro fights and then
Hmm.
have the record be different. Because
Right.
I mean, there were a few fighters early on who had their pro careers probably negatively affected by that because they try to get signed and they say, "Oh, starting my pro career," and then someone would be like, "Well, oh, your pro record is actually this from World
Hmm.
Series of Boxing," and
Hmm.
but it wasn't that big of a problem. I mean, you look at a lot of the Olympians from 2012 and 2016, they all had WSB fights, and most
Hmm.
of them just went to the pros without anyone caring. So I
Hmm.
don't. It's gone anyway. WSB is done. So
Right, right. I mean, it's just that, everyone's obsessed about the zero on their record. And if you don't even have
yeah,
a chance to keep it when you're going into the pro right away with some couple losses, on your record, that kind of sucks. So I can totally understand why, for boxers, it's still a big deal. I mean, it's just marketing at the end of the day in terms of the record. But cool, man. Hey, that was a cool snippet. I think I'm gonna cut it out and just put it as a separate video because you just provided us a cool piece of information in that regards, and maybe it will help a lot of people in boxing as well. Ryan, thanks so much for coming onto my podcast. I really appreciate it. Anytime, you have time and we can talk about, it's almost as if I'm reading a book about boxing, man. So thank you so much.
yeah. Thanks. I said it was going to be better than last time. It was a lot better.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And the content and the lighting, everything is super cool. So, but however, I hope we're gonna do a trilogy because you are here in Canada. So all you need to do is just come down here, and once the whole thing with the pandemic is over, come over to my place. We're gonna record it, one more time. We're gonna speak about current events and so on and so forth. So the invitation is always open to you, my friend.
Definitely. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ryan. Goodbye.